So my grandfather, my mom's dad, seemed to have quite the workshop going on for him. As a matter of fact, he had so many tools and whatnot. My dad wound up getting a lot of them. And there's a few of those tools that wound up trickling their way into my possession as well along the way. Well, with quite the workshop, needless to say, he had a number of projects of which he would do. And one of these projects were these little plaques, dark stained wood for the base of it. But then there were these thin rectangular pieces of blocks of wood that were put together in such a way, in the same way on every single one. And the thing is, when you look at these, at first, you're not quite sure what it is that it says or what it's supposed to be. Last week, one of my friends and my oldest son got their first look at one of these plaques. And it was kind of funny, / I kind of felt sad and sorry for them. But as my parents and I are waiting expectantly for an aha moment to occur, to happen, it finally got to the point where they saw it. And as they're trying to figure it out, though, like, I know the strategy that they were using to try to identify what it is that they're holding in their hands, that they were holding in their hand. And because it's the same strategy that I've used when I first saw it. When you look at something, you're initially looking at the things that seem obvious. The lighter blocks of wood, in this case, are jumping off and that have been attached to this base, this background, basically. You think to yourself, surely what I'm supposed to be looking at or trying to identify, it has to be the thing that is literally popping out at me. And then you get that aha moment where you realize, wait a minute. It's in the background. These plaques, they say Jesus on them. The thing is, Jesus isn't found in the blocks of wood that are popping off the plaque. Jesus is found in the background. In last week's lectionary reading, we learned a bit of Moses' origin, being placed in a basket and some reeds along the Nile as a way to hopefully save him from Pharaoh's decree of killing all the Hebrew baby boys by throwing them, ironically, in the Nile. Pharaoh's granddaughter finds this baby in a basket, adopts him as her own, and Moses grew up as an Egyptian. At the same time, he grew up knowing that he wasn't really one of them. He knew his heritage, he knew his people, which led to some incredibly conflicted feelings as he saw his people by blood being abused and enslaved by the Egyptians. And in a fit of rage concerning how one of these Egyptian slave drivers' treatment of beating one of his fellow Hebrews, it led him into a rage. And in a crime of passion, he killed that Egyptian and tried to bury the evidence. But of course, the evidence was found and people knew who he was. And he realized that even though he was a man with feet in two different worlds, neither world fully accepted him. As now the Egyptians were running after him to get the wheels of justice running. And the Hebrew people didn't really seem to trust him, considering the fact that he was born and raised as an Egyptian with all of the benefits that came with it, while they themselves were being beaten and enslaved and working hard for the people that so generously took in Moses. And so he ran for his life. He ran into the middle of nowhere, just hoping to fade into the background, trying to forget his former life. As while he was out in the middle of nowhere, that he found someone, married them, settled down, and wound up looking after his father-in-law's sheep. Now, while leading sheep around, Moses brings the sheep towards a mountain, Horeb, the mountain of God. Moses had escaped to this place that was remote and in the background, if you will, and a place where nothing really seemed ornate or special, and that was kind of on purpose. He was trying to go as off the grid as possible. And then, all of a sudden, as he's walking along with these sheep, going up a mountain, he comes across this bush that's on fire. But at the same time, it's not being consumed by the fire, by the flames that are licking at its leaves. This is new. And while he tried to figure it out, as he was beginning to inspect this burning yet not burning bush, it talked. A voice emanated from a bush that was on fire but wasn't on fire. Something drew Moses towards this bush even before it started speaking and giving him directions to take the sandals of his feet off, for he found himself in a holy place. I wonder if there was some kind of subconscious recognition from Moses here. A recognition where Moses realized that there had been something that had been eating away at him for all these years, that had been consuming him for all these years, eating away at his self-worth, eating away at his self-value, eating away at who he was or who he was supposed to be. I recognize this could be a stretch, but we're human beings. We often live our lives on a stretch. But maybe, just maybe, if he could figure out what was keeping this bush from being consumed by that which was consuming it or supposed to be consuming it, maybe there was some hope for him. That with all these things that were eating away at him, if this bush could survive not being consumed, maybe he could learn how to survive without being consumed any longer, despite everything that was happening to him. I've come to help was the message from this bush that was being conveyed to Moses. I can imagine Moses asking, well, what are you going to do, bush? If you want to help your people, what are you going to do? Uproot yourself and walk into Egypt? What are you going to do? All you're going to do is distract a few Egyptians for a moment or two. How are you going to help your people? And the answer was, I'm sending you. For Moses, when he realizes that God is calling him, he recognizes that statement to be just as absurd as the idea of a burning bush taking on all of Egypt. It's hard for someone to stand up to something or someone when they don't even know what or who they are themselves. How am I supposed to tackle this massive project when I don't even know what I'm capable of? Moses, in his stutters, manages to get out, who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the Israelites out of Egypt? Who am I? He remembers the Israelites not thanking him for trying to come to his Hebrew brother's aid. And he certainly has come to the conclusion that he had been disowned by his adopted royal family. So who was he to be God's choice in saving God's people? He's just a guy in the background who is just trying to fade away into it. Who am I to do this for you, God? You got the wrong guy. Having little to no self-worth, Moses would try to point out why God was wrong in his choice. And the verses following. And he even questions who this presence is that he's supposed to convey to the people that he's supposed to save. God, when I go to save the Israelites, they're going to ask, well, who are you? Who sent you? What name am I supposed to give them that they would just magically believe me all of a sudden? And in a manner that juxtaposes Moses' questioning his own self-worth and his own full ability and potential. A confidence. A voice states with confidence and surety that the name Moses is to share is I am who I am. Cryptic for sure, but pretty much straightforward and to the point. Moses had just found God in the very place where he had least expected to encounter anything or anyone of importance. And now the great I am who I am was calling this guy who didn't know who he was himself to jump out from the background he had tried so hard to fade into and do something worthwhile. As great a story as this is, confronting who you are in light of God's plan can oftentimes get messy. In the gospel reading for this week, we pick up right after last week's reading, where we see Peter claiming that Jesus is the Son of God, and immediately following all of this talk about keys and loosing and binding, then don't tell anyone. We see this morning that Jesus starts to further unveil the plan and gets into the nitty-gritty that was bound to take the disciples for a loop. Perhaps feeling emboldened by being praised so well by Jesus, upon hearing that Jesus would sacrifice himself, Peter gets up and, not wanting to think about losing his teacher, his friend, his mentor, Peter once again speaks up, God forbid it, Lord. This must never happen to you. And as quickly as Peter had just been praised for his openness, for the insight that he had opened himself up to receive from God, the heavenly parent, Jesus then turns around and tells Peter, get behind me, Satan. Well, that seemed harsh, didn't it? Or was that just me? I mean, Peter did just decide that he was in a place to correct Jesus. That's not always the best part to put yourself in, admittedly. Maybe Peter was trying on an interpretation of this whole, you get the keys to the kingdom and you can loose and bind what you want to loose and bind, and decided to bind Jesus to this place while at the same time loosing this idea that he would have to sacrifice himself. Maybe. Nice try, I guess. In Peter's defense, though, it doesn't seem to make much sense. The Son of God suffering at the hands of men? The one that's supposed to save us all being sacrificed like that? I mean, I don't blame Peter at all for being confused. I mean, sure, we can acknowledge that Peter was confused and had a lot of chutzpah to try to correct God. I mean, after all, God is and does a lot of things that we don't understand. But you would have to have a lot of chutzpah to correct Jesus and try to define him on your own terms for sure. But hey, nothing we haven't done ourselves, right? How many times have we got it in our heads that we could define what God should or shouldn't do our own selves? You have to admit it. We have a good idea of what our Savior should act like and be like. And then, like Peter, we have to admit that Jesus doesn't necessarily look like that mold that we would make, that we would develop. I mean, wouldn't we rather choose a superhero or at the very least a James Bond-like super spy before we would pick a random carpenter's son? Someone with a little more action and a little less sacrificing. That is, if we were the ones calling the shots, right? This is likely because we've grown up in a society that emphasizes battles and punishment and eye for an eye. We think in terms of power and who is winning. And then there's Jesus, who had told Peter to put his sword away that night in Gethsemane. Jesus, who is saying that he would sacrifice himself for us. Jesus, instead of showing us winning no matter the cost, he shows us new terms to live by. Presence. community, connection. We have been looking at power and winning in battles as a way to be saved, as a way of securing security for ourselves. But Jesus challenges that. What if it's not about being the winner, but instead about being present with others? What if being safe isn't about being able to exert power over others and keeping them at a distance, but instead being in community with one another? What if instead of punishing one another for wrongs, we connected in order to seek understanding so that the harm doesn't happen again? Admittedly, Jesus' way takes a lot of work. It's not the obvious route that we see. However, how many times have we witnessed people living their lives consumed with punishing or seeking out power, yet never truly finding peace, never truly finding satisfaction in their lives? We oftentimes find ourselves in situations where we're looking at the wrong thing. The thing that pops out to us, the obvious thing, is what we think we need to live our lives by. And so we put our focus on the wrong themes or the wrong values for living. And Moses thought, who am I? I'm just a shepherd in the middle of nowhere, of no value to God. Why use me? He looked at the circumstances in his life and thought, this is the only way that I can be defined. Surely God couldn't use someone like me effectively. Peter, after Jesus reprimanded him, very easily could have thought, who am I that I would think to put Jesus the Christ, the Son of God, into a box of my own design? And we realize that sometimes we say, who am I? And we attribute a little bit more to ourselves than we ought. And we try to minimize God or define God. Now we get to ask ourselves the question, who am I? A person that is motivated by the values that Jesus showed us, values that are oftentimes fading into the background of the society that we live in, or the things that have proven time and again to fail bringing about true fulfillment, the things that we're told are important and we ought to focus on. Who am I? May we be a people who, when we ask ourselves that very question, come to the conclusion that we're a people who value that which Jesus showed us, a people that are loved, and be present and connected with one another and with that heavenly power that is calling us to so much more. God bless.